I'm Chris Fowler. I'm Director of Product Operations at GitHub. And my talk today is going to be about how we've started to really think of process as code within our organization and how we can start to connect all these different documents that we have into kind of real automation opportunities for product operations professionals. So with that, we'll maybe ask the question here. How recently have you updated your process documentation? And most of the time that I'd uh, join a new team or I would look at like documentation that people have put together, it ends up being years and years ago that they've actually updated it. And so even though they may have new ways of working, there may be kind of more current actual ways that they get the job done. It's not updated, and because it's not updated, that means that people that are joining a new team, people that are trying to understand how to work with that team, may end up using very outdated information on how to talk and work with them. And I think these ideas of very old how we work documentation, they're stored sometimes maybe in a Google Doc, a Word doc, or as a README file in a repo, but they become outdated very quickly. And maybe another artifact that we do not take enough advantage of are all these different meetings that we have. They all can generate transcripts and recaps nowadays, but they end up just kind of being thrown in the trash and not really utilized. And so, I think not only are there opportunities to be able to learn from these meeting transcripts about what is actually going on, there's no process linkage other than maybe people going back in and manually updating these things. And so, what I want to talk about today is something that we've been using inside of GitHub for the last couple of months. And it's a new project that came out of GitHub Next called Agentic Workflows. And agentic workflows are really this idea of how do we start to use agents, right? And the idea of LLMs on the back end being able to take on complex tasks. And how do we link it up with the artifacts that we have today? And so, very excited about this. I've been using it, as I said, for the last couple of months before it's going out. It was as a tech preview, and I think the things to understand about agentic workflows is one, they're really just kind of CI/CD actions inside of GitHub under the hood. And I think that's pretty powerful because there's lots of times that you'll want to have some type of deterministic process working alongside something that's more non-deterministic, maybe driven by AI or an agent of some type. And like every action, it includes something called the front matter, which is really about when this type of thing should trigger. And then even the idea of, you may want AI to eventually work on some type of content to either synthesize or translate or kind of create like a more interesting or helpful kind of analysis of something. You may sometimes want to have the gathering of the data to be very deterministic. I think the other aspect of this is that then it includes instructions that are really for the agents. So we basically running the Copilot CLI against some type of model, but also because of the fact that when a lot of the times when we would build out these more deterministic actions, we would have to then also generate documentation for humans to read. What I've found with agentic workflows is that I can use the instructions that are there for agents for people to then also understand how things work or how they should work. And then finally, there's something I think is really important for agents operating within an enterprise space, which is this thing called safe outputs. And safe outputs are a way for you to restrict down what exactly the agent can take action on. So you may want it to say gather data from a repo, may want to look at like issues, but then you only want it to like create a discussion post once per run, or you only want it to create a PR within that repo. And so with the agentic workflows, you can kind of specify what actions this type of thing can take. And same thing with which tools it can use, what websites it can access. But I think that's really powerful when it comes to putting guardrails on top of these agents in general, especially if they're operating with the data that you have inside of a large organization. And so here's an example of particular agentic workflow. This one is really just like a docs updater, but you can see here that it has certain types of permissions of what it can work on, what it can look at. And then the save outputs kind of say that it can only really create pull requests. It can't do anything else. And then there's these kind of markdown format style instructions for the agent, which are very easily understood by a human being. Um, and so I think what's really exciting for me about using these agentic workflows is kind of stemming from the fact that this was originally built for engineering use cases. And so that could mean things like automated code reviews from different viewpoints. It could mean documentation maintenance from the standpoint of like, whenever you end up pushing a PR of new functionality, you want it to also then update the architectural design docs that are stored in the repo so that agents can also get the benefit of understanding the new kind of work in some way. And then, the kind of quintessential that a lot of the times things will fail when you're doing automations. And so being able to do kind of more nuanced or subjective understanding of why something is failing are some pretty standard cases that have come out of the agentic workflows team. Um, what I've started to now think about is if we take a look at this from the standpoint of say, a product operations or a product person, where is this agentic context that we want to allow the agent to not only pull from, but also operate on? And so the traditional kind of GitHub issues, discussions, PRs, code, those are things that you can gain access to automatically. But what you may want to also include when it comes to context are maybe M365 documents or Google Drive documents. The places that you end up storing the way that the team actually does its work. We call them how we work documents, but really, what is the process by which we make decisions within this team? How do we prioritize things? If you want to work with us or you want to have us take a look at something, how do you do that? Like a contribution guide. You may also start to utilize things like strategic trade-offs. And those strategic trade-offs are yet another document that I think gets updated maybe a little bit more frequently than the how we work documentation. But there are plenty of times I've gone into a strategy document that maybe was written 6 months to a year ago, but hasn't really been updated based on what the latest ways that we end up making decisions inside that organization. And then finally, I think like transcripts of meetings, right? This is probably like very ephemeral information that is not used as much for the automations that we've been starting to build out. They tend to be kind of siloed away inside of Microsoft Teams or inside of a Zoom transcript, kind of stored somewhere with the other recordings. And then even async message communication, so like Slack or Teams or something like that. All of these things are helpful context to be able to keep how we work documents, strategy documents, and really just like any type of documentation that the team might need up to date. And so pulling from all of these different context sources, when we build these agentic workflows and we operate on top of these artifacts that exist, writing the instructions for the agent is the same thing as the spec that you might write for like a new process that you'd want to put together. And it is the same thing as execution for the agent to actually do this, but also when to potentially involve humans. And so this is a very powerful concept when we start to have all of the processes that we build out as these kind of instruction files that both humans and agents can read. And so there's a couple of recipes that these are based on real world examples that we've done inside of GitHub, and I've seen other people do as well. So maybe the first one that I think is pretty common is this idea of a weekly roll up of status. And so what we found, we've actually open sourced a few things out of this team called Synapse inside of GitHub around rollups, and it was fairly complex to be able to get the right type of logic to grab a bunch of comments on issues for the last 7 days and do this inside of a project view and pull it in together and then use some type of kind of format instructions to be able to create a good roll-up. And often these roll-ups do get kind of standardized within organizations because usually leaders want to have all of their teams kind of report to them the same way. They may set that format based on the way that they actually have to report to their leaders as well. but there's still a filtering step that takes place. One of the first things that I've seen almost everybody do is use these types of agentic workflows to actually do this roll up in a very dynamic way. And one of the things that I've discovered as we've done this, well, agents are good at kind of synthesizing that information, collecting it out of the organization's issues in a very particular way still not worked as well. And so this is one of those cases where a deterministic pre-step within the agentic workflow is still really valuable. Um, but I think that those roll-ups, and we've been starting to build out patterns of agents that will allow for the standard kind of gathering all the information and then deciding what to do with it in the regular instructions, but then having kind of how to now format it for this team as a separate instruction that the agent uses so that it can pull it in as it needs to. And then it can also be customized for that team because sometimes teams have subtle nuances in the way that they like to report certain things. Another thing that I've built out for a couple different teams has been really taking that weekly sync meeting where you're meeting with the whole team and talking about maybe even just going through a project view list of issues that you're either trying to prioritize, triage, or just work on. And so building out a way to be able to just drop a transcript somewhere and then have that automatically turn into updates on every issue ends up saving the team an awful lot of time. Whereas before you'd have to kind of like type in real time on each issue with maybe shoddier kind of notes. They're maybe don't make that much sense without the full context of what the conversation was about. But this is one thing that I found to be like a huge time saver, definitely saving someone at least 30, 60 minutes per week of having to now update all of these issues. It just automatically happens. Um, the next thing that I think is pretty powerful as a recipe is taking kind of CPO town hall meetings, meetings where maybe there's a sales enablement meeting that tries to talk about what is the roadmap or the future of this team, taking those types of transcripts and using them to actually help either update or annotate a strategy document ends up meaning that these documents never get out of date because like every time that a product leader ends up making a decision or talking about what they will and won't do, this is really just talking about the most recent version of the strategy that is living inside that product leader's head. And so being able to automatically take these transcripts, have a PR that's created against a strategy document that says, here's either like, here's evidence that we're not actually living by the strategy trade-off anymore. And so we should potentially update it. Or that there's a new kind of emergent strategy that has started to happen and now being able to like write that down so that not only people will be able to have a reference document, but also now that agents that are being used in other places in the organization can still build things like, for example, the weekly roll up that we just talked about, being able to have like what is the top priorities for us right now will mean that that roll up is much more effective at actually pointing at the actual like the work that we're doing is valuable and is in alignment. Or if it's not, like why is it not in some way? One of the other things that we've started to build out is this idea of kind of customer feedback comes from a lot of different places. So, for example, the agentic workflow team, they have a public repo that is open source where they get issues into there. There's a GitHub community discussion post where people are posting to. There's a Discord channel. There's multiple internal Slack channels. There's team channels for when they work with Microsoft and even other types of social media measurement that we may do. But they're all in very different places. And so one of the things we may have done previously is try to work with a platform that does this type of customer feedback aggregation. But by being able to very quickly create different kind of agentic monitors that will pull in this information and put it into the same format within the customer feedback kind of like issue list, that allows us to now see all of it together. We can start to like connect which issues are similar or duplicates of each other. We can start to look at kind of where are the hottest topics within the organization. And that allows us to then do triage and prioritization almost automatically. And then being able to understand, that this is maybe the top 5 things that are most important to like all of the different customers that we have inside the community. We can start to even build kind of a slash command style approach where you do a slash on one of these customer feedback issues. It will auto create an issue with all of kind of the customer information stripped out and made more generic, but is helpful for then a coding agent to come and pick up that particular work item. I do think it is really important to have kind of a separation between the idea of raw customer feedback and the work that we actually end up doing. That's what I usually see as like a product manager's job, is to help do that interpretation. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't be hugely helped by all these automation tools to be able to do better triage and prioritization. I think another one that we've been building agentic workflows with is, we may have policies which we have to adhere to, like you need to have like a target date for the release by a certain time, or we need to have like an assignee. A lot of these things may have required either using certain types of platforms that are highly specialized with workflows, but it was sometimes very hard to figure out like what were all the policies at play. But now we can use a very natural language policy guidelines like document, and have the agents look through all of the different like launches or release tracking issues that are out there, and automatically kind of respond with what is how ready is this particular thing. And I think that leads to this next thing, that one of the bigger problems that we've seen for kind of downstream and compliance teams, and that includes like go-to-market or groups like privacy, legal, responsible AI, they often find out about launches or releases way later than they would have liked to. And the reason why is because even if you end up creating a launch here, you may have to go to like 5 or 6 other places to create an intake issue for the privacy legal team. And so with these agentic workflows, we started to experiment with the fact that like when a new launch is created, and that launch includes kind of higher level initiative information plus what is specifically going to be going out. And even if it is kind of incomplete, it still gives a better picture and can help us automatically create drafts for these other compliance teams in the place where they do their work, so that they can see actually an overall queue of what's going on, and what they have to deal with at some point. And so again, these are all examples of agentic workflows that I've built for teams, either at a GitHub level for things like launch tracking and rollup, but also at like a very specific team level, like agentic workflows. The team itself are using a lot of these processes to get help. And I think like the part that comes after this is actually completing this loop, that right now we're talking about taking some changes to artifacts like issues or something like that, and then using that to now create other artifacts. But what we don't have is we don't have this kind of full feedback loop available yet. But this is where we're starting to do more experimentation. So like, let's imagine a future world that if you have a process that you've acknowledged and you are working on, what if like at a certain point that process is just not working out? Like kind of like a almost like ambient retro is constantly happening, that if we're not talking about this process, we're actually not engaging with the process as it's set up, that this is no longer helpful for the team. And so being able to kind of like give a ritual pip for the fact that this particular thing is not working out as well as we thought it would at first. And so I think this leads us to newer agentic workflows that we're starting to experiment with, which would be, one, I think the very basic thing that the meeting transcripts, as we collect them over time, if it does show that there's a change in the way we're doing something, that should become an automatic PR or kind of like a change to the actual how we work documentation that we have. But then even going a step beyond that is that when we have something like meeting transcripts leading to action items that come out of those transcripts, and then following up on those action items afterwards, like which of these action items were actually were done, or which ones were ignored, which ones were never completed. This will then point to the way the team actually makes decisions. And so now being able to update our prioritization rubrics, and maybe even mark issues earlier, that this is something that we usually wouldn't take on just because it's not usually that important for the team. I think it saves people a lot of time. It starts to reduce the number of action items. Like if I have a friend that ended up trying to take every meeting that they've ever been in and track all of the action items, and just becomes daunting because of the number of things. And the reality is like we just don't have time to be able to do that for every single action item that we collect. Um, and then I think, after all of this, we can start to say, like, of all of the automations we have today, which ones are working well and which ones need to be improved. But then also, where are there places that people are still kind of doing the bulk of the work? And in reality, we want to provide further automation. And so, what if you could start to auto suggest, based on the automations we have today, what types of improvements would be able to be made to them, or what automations are potentially good things that we should create. And so we've started to kind of like not do this fully automatically yet, but getting a report of, say for the last 2 months worth of meetings versus the how we work versus all the automations we have, it does create a pretty interesting picture of everything that we're starting to understand or do within the team. And so, I'd say just in closing, and I want to leave some time for questions, that, the process, our process is what we do, what we talk about, what we actually update, what we don't update. This is the real process. And this is probably the hardest thing for us to start to realize and maybe gain some benefit from, is that if we don't look at the signals of what is actually happening, and we're not as transparent or understanding like what is actually valuable to the team, we end up doing a lot of things that are not helpful. And this is where we get kind of a split, where there's what we say we do versus the true shadow system that exists there. And I think with these types of tools, especially agentic workflows, we can start to close that gap. And that means that there's the reality of the team is much more kind of aligned with what we think about ourselves as a team as well. And then, process really should be code. It should be executable by both humans and these new agents that are starting to be brought in. Now, I don't necessarily think that agents are like coworkers. Over the last couple of months that I've been working with kind of the technology of agents, it doesn't feel like people. And I don't think it should, because what we should be having people do is build working relationships with the people that are on their team. They should be making the hard decisions. They should be using their intuition and, if you want, expertise to be able to make a final decision. But then the machine should really carry out that execution. And so I think that is the one thing that I believe will be benefited by the most when we start to adopt these types of agentic workflows. So again, process is code, and especially with the way that instructions work for agents, it can be the same thing. And we should not use people double checking 3 different spreadsheets to make sure that everything is actually true. We should be using machines for this. So with that, if you're interested in getting these slides, a link to agentic workflows, and a couple other things, I put all of this at this link, and you can scan this QR code. And then, I would love to get your feedback about these ideas. And if you try anything like this, I would love to hear how it works for you. And with that, happy to take some questions.